Hi, everyone, and welcome to Red Carpet TV. This is one of my TV stations here on YouTube, as well as Facebook Live and many more RSS feeds. I'm going to present different type of news stories as well as actors spotlights. And don't forget tomorrow night to tune in and turn on to one of my special actors tomorrow night at 6:30. Right now, I'm going to talk about the Fair Doctrine Act. And it's something that actually nobody really talks about, and that is the Fairness Doctrine Act. And it is actually from the FCC, and it was introduced in 1949, and it was a policy that required the holders of broadcast licenses to both present controversial issues of public importance and to do so in a manner that was honest, equitable, and balanced. And in 1987, the FCC abolished the Fairness Doctrine, prompting some to argue its reintroduction through either commission policy or congregational legislation. However, later the FCC removed the rule that implemented the policy from the federal registration in August of 2011. Okay, so the Fairness Doctrine had two basic elements, and I'm just going to put this here. I'm going to read this to you, okay? Because this I feel is so important, you guys, because our news today, we're getting all this different news. Like somebody will be like, well, you don't know what you're talking about. And the other person is like, well, you don't know what you're talking about. And then nobody knows what they're talking about. And nobody knows what's censored, uncensored, and uncensored. And your news is uncensored. It is not censored news today. Okay. And there's many things that when I was reading, I kind of scratched my head and I said, wow, well, what's going on? I'm a communications major. I went to school in Boston and I went to Pine Manor College and I have a degree in a bachelor's degree in communications. So I decided, well, what can I give my audience? What can I tell them? So, all right, the Fairness Doctrine had two basic elements, and it required that broadcasters devote some of their airtime into discussing controversial matters of public interest and air contrasting views regarding those matters. Stations were given wide latitude as to how to provide contrasting views, and it could be done through news segments, public affairs shows, editorials, etc. And the doctrine actually did not require equal time for opposing views, but required that contrasting viewpoints be presented. And the demise of this FCC rule has been considered by some to be contributing factors for the rising level of party polarization in the United States. So, I went on, I looked and I said, well, I think there's something seriously wrong here. And maybe we need to bring this rule back because, we need to know, what's going on. So then I dug a little further and I said to myself, okay, well, how did this actually happen? So I went into it and I looked and it said here, the main agenda for the doctrine was to ensure that viewers were exposed to a diversity of viewpoints. And in 1969, the United States Supreme Court in Red Lion Broadcasting Company versus the FCC upheld the FCC's general right to enforce the Fairness Doctrine, and where channels were limited, right? And however, the court did not rule that the FCC was obligated to do so. So the court's reason that the scarcity of broadcast spectrum, which limited the opportunity for access to the airwaves, which created the need for the doctrine. So the Fairness Doctrine is not the same as equal time rule, which I'm going to get into later after this, which is still in place. But I don't even think that was in place because in the last election, when we saw on TV, nobody had when we saw political parties go against one another, those news people sat there and they gave one person more time and the other person less time. So the equal time rule, that I'm going to read that after, all right? But it says that that's still in place, okay? So the Fairness Doctrine deals with discussion of controversial issues, while the equal time rule deals with only political candidates. How interesting is that? I find it fairly, very, very, very like important, okay? All right, so this is how it all happened, okay? In 1938, like a former Yankee network employee named Lawrence J. Flynn, right? He challenged that license of John Shepard III from WAAB and in Boston, right? And he also lodged a complaint about WNAC, right? And Flynn asserted that these stations were being used to air a one-sided political viewpoint and broadcast attacks, including editorials, right, against local and federal politicians that Shepard opposed, right? So after that, the FCC requested that Shepard provide the details about these programs and to appease the commission, and the Yankee Network agreed to drop the editorials. But Flynn created a company called the Mayflower Broadcasting and tried to get the FCC to award him WAAB's license. However, the FCC just refused that. Instead, in 1941, the commission made a ruling that came to be known as the Mayflower Decision, which declared the radio station to do their public interest obligations and which remain neutral in the matters of news and politics, right? So they were not allowed to give editorial support to any particular political position or candidate, all right? So in 1949, the FCC's editorialization report repealed that Mayflower Doctrine, which had forbidden editorializing on the radio since 1941, and laid the foundation that the Fairness Doctrine be affirming the FCC's holding that licenses must not use the stations for the private interest, right? Whims and caprices, I think of licenses, something, I didn't know how to say that, but anyway, but in the manner which will serve the community generally, right? So the FCC report established two forms of regulations for the broadcasters, and that was to provide adequate coverage of public issues and to ensure that the coverage was fairly represented, fairly represented of the opposing views, which I don't find that that's today, do you? I mean, please comment below and tell me what you feel. All right, the second rule required that broadcasters to provide reply time to issue-oriented citizens. Broadcasters could therefore trigger fairness doctrine complaints without editorializing. The commission required neither of the Fairness Doctrine obligations before 1949. Until then, broadcasters had to satisfy only general public interest standards of the Communications Act. So I find this like really interesting. And so I went on and I kind of was like studying all this, and it was like really confusing to me. So I figured I would just read it to everybody and make everybody aware of the Fair Doctrine Act, excuse me. So the doctrine remained a matter of general policy and was applied on a case-by-case basis until 1967, right? And when certain provisions of the doctrine were incorporated into FCC regulations. So in 1969, right, the United States Courts of Appeals, in an opinion written by Warren Burger, directed the FCC to revoke Lamar Broadcasting licenses for television station WLBT due to the station's segregationist politics on ongoing censorship of NBC network news coverage of the U.S. civil rights movement. So, this happened like kind of in 1969, but I'm going to forward it a little bit more, and we're going to talk about the applications of this doctrine. So the applications of the doctrine by the FCC in 1974, the FCC stated that the Congress had delegated its power to mandate a system of access either free or paid for a person or groups wishing to express a viewpoint on a controversial public interest, but that it had not yet exercised, right, the power because licensed broadcasters had voluntarily complied with the spirit of the doctrine. And it warned, quote, it warned, should future experience indicate that the doctrine of voluntary compliance is adequate either in its expectation or in its results, the commission will have to have the opportunity and the responsibility for such reassessment and action would be mandated. So in one landmark case, the FCC argued that teletext, right, was the new technology that was created and it was soaring and it was in high demand and for, you know, a limited resource. And this could be exempt from the Fairness Doctrine. So the telecommunication resource, which is TRAC, right, and the Media Access Program, which is called MAP, argued that teletext transmission should be regulated like any other airwave technology. Hence, the Fairness Doctrine was applicable and must be enforced by the FCC. So then, in 1986, judges Robert Bork, Antonin Scalia of the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit concluded that the Fairness Doctrine did apply to teletext, but that the FCC was not required to apply for it. In 1987, Meredith Corp versus FCC, two other judges of the same court declared that Congress did not mandate the doctrine and the FCC have not continued to enforce it. All right, so here, let's go to the Red Lion Broadcasting, okay, and the FCC. Okay, so those two go together, and they go against each other, and the U.S. Supreme Court upheld a vote 8-0 that constitutionally of the Fairness Doctrine in a case of an on-air personality attack, right? In response of the challenge that the doctrine violated the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Here we're back to where we are today, right? Freedom of speech is being, you know, freedom of speech. Here we go again with the First Amendment. So the case began, and it was a journalist, which was Fred J. Cook, right? And after the publication of his Goldwater, right, extremist of the right was a topic of discussion by Billy James Hargis on his daily Christian Crusade radio broadcast on WGCB in Red Lion, Pennsylvania. And Cook sued, he actually sued, arguing that the Fairness Doctrine entitled him to free airtime to respond to the personal attacks, you see? Okay, so although similar laws are unconstitutional when applied to the press, the court cited a Senate report. And it was, stating that radio stations, right, could be regulated in this way because of the limited public airwaves at that time. Writing for the court, Justice Byron Wright, and he declared this, okay? He declared a license permit broadcasting, but a license has no constitutional right to be the one who holds the license or to monopolize a radio frequency to the exclusion of his fellow citizens, right? And there's nothing in the First Amendment which prevents the government from requiring a license to share his frequency with others. It is the right of the viewers and the listeners, not the right of the broadcasters, which is paramount. So, I want to go back into talk radio. When we came into talk radio was more like, well, you could say kind of what you want in talk radio. You were able to give your opinion, and it didn't really have to be the right opinion, but you could give your opinion and you can state what you want. So, moreover, going back to the Fairness Doctrine Act, the court didn't see how the Fairness Doctrine went against the First Amendment and the goal of creating an informed public, right? The Fairness Doctrine required that those who were talked about, given chance to respond to the statements made by broadcasters. And so the court believed that this helped create a more informed public. So Justice White, right, he explained that without this doctrine, station owners would only have people on the air who agreed with their opinions and everything, right? So throughout his opinion, without his opinion, Justice White argued that radio frequencies, right, and by the extension, television stations at that time, should be used to educate the public about controversial issues so that they can create their own opinions. All right, so I'm talking about the Fairness Doctrine Act, and it is abolished now, and it was abolished during the Reagan years in 1987, and it was totally abolished during the Obama years in 2011. So I'm very passionate about this subject because I believe you need to bring back some fairness back into news and give us people some fair news. We deserve it. The public deserves it. I think you would all agree that we all get some wackadoodle news out there. Okay, so anyway, the court ruled unanimously in 1969 that the Fairness Doctrine was not only constitutionally but essential to democracy, and that public airwaves should not just express the opinion of those who can pay for airtime. They must allow the electorate to be informed about all sides of controversial issues, right? So the court also warned that if the doctrine was ever restrained speech, then it's constitutionally should be reconsidered. And that's what happened. It was reconsidered, right? So I'm going to move on to 1984. The Supreme Court ruled that Congress could not forbid editorials by nonprofit stations that received grants from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And this is like corporate for like the FCC versus the League of Women Voters of California. This is when this happened. The court was a 5-4 majority decision, and by William J. Brennan Jr. stated that while many considered that expanding sources of communication have made the Fairness Doctrine limits totally unnecessary. So this is what was said. We are not prepared, however, to reconsider our long-standing approach without some signal from Congress or FCC that technological developments had advanced so far that some revision of the system of broadcast regulation may be required. You see, we've become so, God, we are so technical today, right? We have our phones, we can get news from here, we can get news from there, we can get news from here and there and everywhere, right? Okay, so after noting the FCC was considered repealing the Fairness Doctrine rules on editorials and personal attacks out of fear that those rules might be chilling speech, the court added, right? So, of course, the commission may, in the exercise of discretion, decide to modify or abandon these rules. And we express no view on the legality or either course, as we recognize, and this all happened with Red Lion back in the day, in the 1940s, okay? And it also happened with one of Yankee, Flynn, okay? All right, I'm gonna go the basics of this Fair Doctrine Act. I know this is really long, you guys, but this is so important that you all realize what happened and why our news is uncensored. And it's uncensored because basically of freedom of speech, which, you know, we're allowed to say what we want, how we want, and we're allowed to give out those news stories, okay? And so in 1985, under the FCC chairman, Mark S. Fowler, which I mentioned before, he's a communications attorney, which I hope to study law soon, and I'm very excited, hopefully, who knows, okay? But anyway, he served on Ronald Reagan's presidential campaign, right? And he was one of his staff in the 1976 and 1980, and the released its report on the General Fairness Doctrine Act, right? And he stated that the doctrine hurt the public, right? And it hurt the public interest, and it violated free speech and the free speech rights guaranteed by the First Amendment, like I just said. So the commission could not, however, come to the determination as whether the doctrine had been enacted by Congress or whatever. And through its 1959 amendment to Section 315 of the Communication Act, okay? So in the response of 1986, the Telecommunications Research said, and the decision of the 99th Congress directed that the FCC examine alternatives of the Fairness Doctrine and to submit a report to Congress. And then in 1987, the case was returned to the FCC with the directive to consider whether the doctrine had been self-generated to pursuant to its general congressional authorization of specifically mandated by Congress. Wow, that was a mouthful, okay? But the FCC opened an inquiry inviting the public to comment on an alternative means for administering and enforcing the Fairness Doctrine. Okay, and in 1987, the report, the alternatives, including abandoning a case-by-case enforcement approach, replacing the doctrine with open access, time for all members of the public, doing away with the personal attack rule. You can't personally attack anybody. You're not allowed to personally attack people. And eliminating certain other aspects of doctrine were rejected by the FCC for various reasons. So in 1987, this guy, Dennis R. Patrick, he was like one of the FCC chairmen, right? He abolished the doctrine by a 4-0 vote. And that was in Syracuse, the Peace Council decision, right? And which was upheld by a panel of appeals. And in February in 1989, though, the court stated in their decision that they made, the determination without reaching the constitutional editorial, the FCC suggested that Syracuse Peace Council, that because of the many media voices in the marketplace, like today, the doctrine be deemed unconstitutional, stating, this is what they stated, stating, the intrusion by government into the content of programming, occasional by enforcement of the Fairness Doctrine, restricts the journalist freedom of broadcasters and actually inhibits the presentation of controversial issues of public importance to the detriment of public and degradation of the editorial prerogative, of broadcast journalists, okay? And the 4-0 chairman, Patrick, said, we seek to extend to the electronic press the same First Amendment guarantee that the print media have enjoyed since the country's inception. Well, with all this, the FCC vote opposed by members of the Congress said that the FCC had tried to flout, right? They flout the will of the Congress. And the decision was wrong-headed and misguided and illogical. Is it illogical? And the decision drew political fire. Can you believe it? Well, I can. And then the cooperation with Congress was one issue. In June in 1987, the Congress attempted to preempt the FCC decision and codify the Fairness Doctrine. So Ronald Reagan, which, I liked Ronald Reagan, but another attempt to revive the doctrine in 1991. And it was stopped when Bush threatened another veto. Fowler said in February in 2009, his work toward revoking the Fairness Doctrine under the Ronald Reagan administration had been a matter of principle, not partisanship. Fowler described the White House staff raising concerns at that time before the prominence of conservative talk radio during preeminence of the big three television networks and PBS in political discourse, that repealing the policy would be politically unwise. You think? He described the staff's position as saying to Reagan, the only thing that really protects you from the savages of the three networks, every day they would savage Ronald Reagan, is the Fairness Doctrine, and Fowler is proposing to repeal it. Okay, let's go into conservative talk radio. In 1987, Fairness Doctrine enabled the risk of talk radio has been described as unfiltered. Hey, we have unfiltered, almost everything today is unfiltered, right? So being unfiltered is being unfiltered. What can I say? Okay. Rush Limbaugh was one of them. And there was, let's see. It said Limbaugh to the station at an unbeatable price, free. So he had a free station. All they had to do is carry his program was to set aside 4 minutes per hour for ads that McLaughlin's company sold to national sponsors. Prior to 1987, people using much less controversial verbiage had been taken off the air as obvious violations of the Fairness Doctrine Act. So, I don't know, do you guys have any, this is a lot. This is a lot to handle. All right, so there are two corollary rules of the doctrine, the personal attack rule. So in political editorial rule, that remained in practice until 2000, right? The personal attack rule applied whenever a person or a small group was subject to a personal attack during a broadcast. Station had to notify such persons or group within a week of the attack, send them transcripts of what was said, and offer them opportunity to respond on the air. The political editorial rule applied when a station's broadcast editorial endorsing or opposing candidates for public office. It stipulated that the unendorsed candidates be notified and allowed at a reasonable opportunity to respond. You know, every time when I read this, it kind of makes me a little nervous because, you know, when this act was abolished, now we have everything uncensored. We're not allowed to, we're allowed to say whatever we want, basically. And we're allowed to say what we want. We're allowed to do what we want. And, you know, if we attack somebody, we're allowed to have them on TV, and we have to give them an opportunity to respond. Okay, so the FCC is, let's see, he says the decision to repeal the Fairness Doctrine, the FCC did not provide prompt jurisdiction for both corollary rules were repealed in 2000. This goes on and on and on. I'm going to tell you, we go on until 2011 here. And this is a very, very long thing, okay? So I can't wait to read this back and hear this back so I can understand all this. In 2005, Louise Slaughter, she was a Democratic from New York, and 23 co-sponsors introduced the Fairness and Accountability in Broadcasting Act. It's the first session of the 109th Congress in 2005, when Republicans held a majority of both houses, and the bill would have shortened a station's license term for 8 years to 4 years. Okay, and with the requirement that a license holder cover important issues fairly, hold local public hearings about its coverage twice a year, and document the FCC how it was meeting its obligations. And the bill was referred to committee, but progressed no further. Okay. In the same Congress, Representative Maurice Hinchley, Democrat, New York, introduced legislation to restore the Fairness Doctrine, also known as Media Ownership Reform Act of 2005, or MORA, had 16 co-sponsors in Congress. In June 2007, Senator Richard Durbin, Democrat, said it's time to reinstate the Fairness Doctrine, an opinion shared by his Democrat colleague, Senator John Kerry. However, according to Maren Cogan, the New Republic, Senator Durbin's press secretary said that Durbin has no plans, no language, no nothing. He was asked in a hallway last year, he gave his personal views, and that American people were served well under the doctrine, it says, and it's blown out of proportion. 2008, okay, in 2008, Nancy Pelosi, okay, here we go. The Speaker of the House at the time told reporters that her fellow Democratic representatives did not want to forbid reintroduction of the Fairness Doctrine, adding, "The interest in my caucus is the reverse. When you ask John Gizzi, the human events, do you personally support revival of the Fairness Doctrine?" The Speaker replied, yes. October 22nd, 2008, Senator Jeff Bingman, Democratic, told Conservative Talk Radio in Albuquerque, New Mexico, "I would visit this station, all stations, to present a balanced perspective and different points of view. All I'm saying is that for many years, we operated under Fairness Doctrine in this country, and I think the country was well served. I think the public discussion was at a higher level and more intelligent in those days it has become since." In 2008, U.S. Representative Ann Eshoo, Democratic of California, told the Daily Post in Palo Alto, California, that she thought it should also apply to cable and satellite broadcasters, stating, "I'll work on bringing it back. I still believe in it, and it should and will affect everyone." You know, it's kind of interesting that they wanted it back. I wonder if they would want it back now. I wonder if Democrats would want this Fair Doctrine Act back now. That would be my question as a news outlet. All right, because for some reason they wanted this back in 2008. Now, on February 11th of 2009, Senator Tom Harkin, a Democratic in Iowa, told radio host Bill Press, "We got to get the Fairness Doctrine back in law again." Later, in response to the press assertion that they are just shutting down progressive talk from one city to another. And that's why we need the Fair Doctrine. That's why we need this Fairness Doctrine back. Now, former President Bill Clinton also shown support for this Fairness Doctrine during February of 2009, and his appearance on the Mario Salas anyway, his radio show, Clinton said, "Well, you either ought to have the Fairness Doctrine, or we ought to have more balance on the other side." Because essentially there's always been a lot of big money to support the right-wing talk shows. This is really interesting. As I'm reading this, it's getting more interesting by the minute, because for some reason there's something in my head right here that's kind of making me think, oh, wow, what's going on here? Okay. Clinton cited the blatant drumbeat against the stimulus program from Conservative Talk Radio, suggesting that it does not reflect economic reality. Now, in September 19th, Representative Tulsi Gabbard, I know that you know Tulsi Gabbard. She's a Democratic from Hawaii, and she also was on the presidential, she was a presidential candidate before Biden. She introduced to restore that Fairness Doctrine Act in 2019 in the House of Representatives. And Gabbard was the only sponsor and was immediately referred to the House Committee on Energy and Commerce on the same day. And it was then referred to the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology on September 20th in 2019. Wow. And this would mandate equal media discussion, right? And it would be a discussion of key political and social topics requiring television and radio broadcasters to give airtime to opposing sides of issues of civic interest. It also says the summary reads, restore the Fairness Doctrine Act of 2019. This bill requires a broadcast radio and television licenses to provide reasonable opportunity for discussion of conflicting views of matters of public importance. The Restore the Fairness Doctrine Act would once again mandate television and radio broadcasters present both sides when discussing political or social issues, reinstituting the rule in place of 1949 and 1987, which in the beginning of the broadcast, that's what I said. Supporters argue that the doctrine allowed for a more robust public debate and affected positive political change as a result, rather than allowing only the loudest voices or deepest pockets to win. Okay, opposition. Here we got the opposition. Woohoo! Opposition. Okay, so the opposition, the Fairness Doctrine has been strongly opposed by prominent conservatives and libertarians who view it as an attack on the First Amendment right and property rights. Editorials in the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Times in 2005 and 2008 said that the Democratic attempts to bring back the Fairness Doctrine have been made largely in response to conservative talk radio. In 1987, Edward Fritz, president of the National Association of Broadcasters, and applauding President Reagan's veto of a bill intended to turn the doctrine into a law. He said that the doctrine is an infringement on speech and intrudes on broadcasters' journalistic judgment. So in 2007, Senator Norm Coleman, he's a Republican, he proposed an amendment to a defense, it was appropriations bill that forbade the FCC from using any funds to adopt a fairness rule. You see, I thought that the Fairness Doctrine Act in the beginning of my stream here, I thought it was all great to have the Fairness Doctrine Act. But now that I'm reading it, I'm like, wow, I don't know. I'm going to keep reading this, and then I'm going to let you guys decide when you go back into listening to what I'm reading here, because it kind of makes me a little confused, a little bit uneasy about this, but I'm going to keep going. So anyway, in 1987, the Fritz, president of the National Association of Broadcasters, applauded President Reagan's veto of the bill and intended to turn the doctrine into a law that said the doctrine is infringement on free speech, which I just read. In 2007, Norm Coleman proposed an amendment, which I just said, which was a fairness rule, and it was blocked. And part of the grounds that the amendment belonged to the Commerce Committee's jurisdiction. I'm definitely studying law after this. This is crazy. In the same year, the Broadcasters Freedom Act in 2007 was proposed in the Senate by Senators Coleman with 35 co-sponsors and John Thune, who was a Republican from South Dakota, and 8 other co-sponsors. And in the House of Republican Representatives, Mike Pence, a Republican from Indiana, with 208 co-sponsors, it provided. And this is what they said. The commission shall not have the authority to prescribe any rule, regulation, policy, doctrine, standard, or other requirement that had purpose or an effect of reinstating or repromulgating in whole or in part the requirement that broadcasters present opposing viewpoints or controversial issues of public importance, commonly referred to as the Fairness Doctrine, as repealed in General Fairness Doctrine obligation of broadcasters' license. Neither of these measures came to the floor of either house. It's crazy, right? Who would have thought? I would have thought the Fair Doctrine Act would have been like perfect for everybody because it had to do fair balanced, equal news for all of us public. But obviously, it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with, I mean, this is crazy. This is one crazy, complicated law. And Reagan, put the kibosh on it, and then, and then it was vetoed by Bush. And then in 2011, Obama really put the squash on it, and then Nancy Pelosi, and then wanted it back, and now it's not back. So I'm confused here. Okay. Okay. So now in 2008, okay, Commissioner McDowell stated that the reinstitution of the Fairness Doctrine could be intertwined with the debate over network neutrality. Okay, it's a proposal to classify network operators as common carriers required to admit all internet services, applications, and devices on equal terms. Interesting. So it says presenting a potential danger that net neutrality and fairness doctrine advocates could try to expand content controls to the internet. Damn, don't you think that's like today? Don't you think that's what's happening today? It could also include government dictating content policy. A conservative media research center, Cultural Media Institute, argued that three main points supporting the Fairness Doctrine: media scarcity, liberal viewpoints being censored at corporate levels, and public myths are all myths. Damn, that's happening today. What the frick was going on here? Oh my God, I can't believe what I'm reading. Oh my God. All right, in June of 2008, Barack Obama's press secretary wrote Obama, then a Democratic U.S. Senator from Illinois and candidate for president, did not support it. And they stated, Obama does not support reimposing the Fairness Doctrine on broadcasters. Considers this debate to be a distraction from the conversation we should be having about opening up the airwaves and modern communication to as many diverse viewpoints as possible. That is why at the time, Senator Obama supports media ownership caps, network neutrality, public broadcasting, as well as increasing minority ownerships of broadcast and print outlets. Wow, I'm getting to something over here. This is something real. This is something unbelievable. Okay. In 2009, Mark Fowler said, I believe, as President Reagan did, that the electronic press, and you're included in that the press that uses air and electrons should be and must be as free from government control as the press that uses paper and ink, period. Okay, well, I give that a fair thing, but I don't know. With what I'm reading in the beginning, I thought that, wow, this Fair Doctrine Act, wow, they should bring this back. But then now I'm really stumped. I'm really confused. 1 minute I think we should bring this back, and then the other minute I'm like, oh, geez. Okay, so moving on, in 2009, a White House spokesperson said that President Obama continued to oppose the revival of the doctrine. The 111th Congress, and this is in 2009, the Broadcaster Freedom Act of 2009, which was introduced to block reinstatement of the doctrine. Wow. On February 26, it was a vote by 87 to 11 that the Senate added that the act of its amendment to the District of Columbia House Voting Rights Act of 2009, a bill which later was passed the Senate 61 to 37, but not the House of Representatives. The House of the Associated Press, which is the AP, reported that the vote on the Fairness Doctrine rider was in part a response to conservative radio talk show hosts who feared that Democrats would try to revive the policy to ensure liberal opinions equal time. The AP report went on to say that President Obama had no intention of reimposing the doctrine, but Republicans like Jim McMint, which was Republican, wanted more in the way of a guarantee that the doctrine would not be reimposed. Well, today they have, they have what's called free press, right? And this was a reform, which is the free press. And it was the free press feel that the return to the Fairness Doctrine is not as important as setting stronger station ownership caps and stronger public interest standards enforcement with funding from fines given to public broadcasting. Okay. Let's give accurate labeling rules. Under the Fair Packaging and Labeling Act, the FTC requires that all consumer commodities bear a label with accurate statement identifying the commodity. If revenue-generating commercial broadcasts, whether it be radio, TV, or the internet, are consumer commodity, then they must be accurately labeled. That would seem to preclude news that is not genuine, opinion that is not author's actual opinion, and analyst that is not at least arguably analytical. Note that in general, the FCC only has authority over commercial aspects pertaining to revenue rather than speech. Wow, that is unbelievable. And this is unbelievable. And I can't believe I'm reading all this, but this is so important. The Fairness Doctrine Act. And, they abolished it. It came out in 1947. And there were a lot of changes in 1987. They put a kibosh on it. Now, they wanted to bring it back, but Bush vetoed in 1990 and vetoed it to go away. And in 2011, Obama kind of put a squash on it, although he wanted it to come back. He did. In the beginning of my statements, it wasn't true because I was reading and I was, what's going on here? And this is a very long doctrine. This pertains to freedom of speech. It pertains to radio, TV, and the internet. It started with texting or teletext, and there was a lot of changes in 2011, but it's just an unbelievable thing. So, okay, let me go to public opinion now. Okay, in August 2008, right? Telephone polls were released by some Ramsuin reports or whatever. And it was like 47% of the 1,000 likely voters supported a government required that broadcasters offer amounts of liberal and conservative commentary, while 39% opposed such requirement. In the same poll, 57% opposed and 31% favored requiring internet websites and bloggers that offer political commentary to present opposing points of view. But a margin of 71 to 20% of the respondents agreed that it is possible for just about any political view to be heard in today's media, including the internet, newspapers, cable TV, satellite, and radio. But only half the sample said that they had followed recent news stories about the Fairness Doctrine closely. That's pretty interesting, people. If you're listening to this, go and check out the Fairness Doctrine. It's very complicated, but me being a communication major, I wanted to know a lot about it, and I wanted to learn about it. And from the beginning of this, from the beginning of me turning the live broadcast on, I was like, I thought I knew what I was talking about, but then I'm reading this, and I'm scratching my head, and I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe this shit. And I'm allowed to swear on live television here. So, okay, so it says, but only half the samples said that they had followed recent news stories about the Fairness Doctrine closely. The margin of error was 3% with a 95% confidence, okay? We're getting to the end now. I'm excited. All right, in June 2011, the chairman and the subcommittee chairman of the House of Energy and Commerce Committee, both Republican, said that the FCC, in response to their request, had set a target date of August 2011 for removing the Fairness Doctrine and other outdated regulations from the FCC's rule book. And then in August 2022, 2011, the FCC voted to remove that implemented. All right, hold on. August 22, 2011, the FCC voted to remove the rule that implemented the Fairness Doctrine, along with more than 80 other rules and regulations from the federal registration, following an executive order by President Obama directing a government-wide review of regulations already on books to eliminate unnecessary regulations. Aye. All right, well, I'm basically done reading the entire Fairness Act, and now I want to go to something else. Equal time rule. Okay, so equal time rule. What is equal time rule? Well, I'm going to go with our last. Hi, everybody who's tuning in and turning on to Internet World. We just talked about the Fairness Doctrine Act, and it had to be at least 20 minutes long. And I read because I wanted to know more about it, because I feel that our news is kind of wackadoodle today. And I feel, how did our news get so wacky? But it started in 1987, and then it really started in 2011. And then it got really, really bad. And so I wanted to know why. And it all has to do with this Fair Doctrine Act and the First Amendment. So, and I wanted to really know about it. So I dug into it a little bit. And then I wanted to know more. And then it got into the equal time rule, which I'm looking for now. I'm going to just go equal time. All right, here's the equal time rule. Specifies that the U.S. radio and television broadcast stations must provide an equivalent opportunity to any opposing political candidate who requests it. This means, for example, that if a station gives a given amount of time to a candidate in prime time, it must do the same for another candidate who requests it at the same price if applicable. Well, holy crap. Did you watch the last presidential campaign? Where the hell was equal time rule? There was none. I mean, I saw it. If you watched it, I saw it. Did you see it? I saw it. Okay. Here's the detail for that. Okay. It says the rule originated in the Radio Act of 1927. These rules went all the way back when radio became radio and television became television, okay? And it superseded by the Communications Act in 1934. Related provisions require that broadcasters offer time to candidates at the same rate as their most favorable advertiser. This is really interesting. And the equal time rule was created by the FCC. It was concerned that broadcast stations could easily manipulate the outcome of elections by presenting just one point of view and excluding other candidates. Wow. I mean, we got two huge things here, people. We got the Fairness Doctrine Act, and we got equal time rule. I mean, these are two huge things that are going on in our media and during politics today that nobody's even talking about except me. Red Carpet TV. There are 4 exceptions to equal time rule. It's the airing was within a documentary, news interview, scheduled newscast, or on-the-spot news event. The equal time does not apply, which it doesn't apply, okay? I'm going to go into this, but it does say They are not subject, all right, that what I just said with the news events, and as a result, they're not subject to the rule. Consequently, these debates may include only major party candidates without having to offer airtime to a minor party or with independent candidates. Talk shows and other regular news programs from syndicators such as Entertainment Tonight are also declared exempt from the rule by the FCC on a case-by-case basis. An equal time rule was temporarily suspended by Congress in 1960 to permit the Kennedy-Nixon debates to take place. Holy crap! Can you believe this? This whole thing that I'm reading is just ultimately crazy. I mean, I went from the Fairness Doctrine Act to the equal time rule. I want you to look it up if you can. I mean, this is crazy. I can't believe this. Now I just got something, an election day poll, right, from the internet, right? Do you agree with having a vaccine mandate? Like this is coming through this is coming from election day. Now I just got rid of my green screen. Sorry about that. This is the end of my broadcast. Thank you so much for watching on the Red Carpet TV, Red Carpet TV. I appreciate you watching. Tune in for more of my actor spotlights and more of all the things that I have to talk about. I hope you enjoyed my broadcast today, and stay tuned, tune in, turn on. I'll be in tomorrow. Out. That was my news. That was my news.